Okay. We are now entering into unit number 6. And unit number 6 is going to be focused on the pharmacology of the central nervous system. So in this first video, I want to just do a little review. Our objective here is just to kind of review the central nervous system briefly, talk a little bit about neurons, neurotransmitters, and a little bit on synaptic transmission in the central nervous system. So this is going to prime us for our conversation that we're going to have on the individual drug classes that we're going to cover in this particular unit. So, as I'm sure you all know, there are two divisions of the nervous system. One we've already talked about, which is the peripheral nervous system. And in this unit, we're going to be focused on the central nervous system. So, of course, the central nervous system are all the neurons that are found in either the brain and or the spinal cord. So a central nervous system drug is a drug that exerts its effect by acting directly on the brain, or the spinal cord. And as we know, the brain and the spinal cord is ultimately responsible for essentially interpreting, integrating, and formulating responses. So all sensory information travels on sensory neurons that are going to travel towards the central nervous system. So those are afferent neurons. And once that sensory information enters the spinal cord, sometimes it's integrated right there, and then the response is generated right at that level of the spinal cord. That's not super common. Where you probably learned about that is in the most simple of the reflex arcs. More commonly, sensory information travels towards the central nervous system, enters a segment of the spinal cord, and then from there it's going to travel up the spinal cord through the brainstem. It's going to get routed to the appropriate part of the brain that has to ultimately integrate that information, or I should say appropriate portions of the brain. In most cases, there's more than one part of the brain that's going to play a role in this. And from there, we're going to integrate that information and generate an appropriate response. And then, of course, that appropriate response, once it's generated, that information is going to leave this brain, travel down brainstem, spinal cord, and then exit a segment of the spinal cord, ultimately interfacing with a peripheral neuron, which is then going to do the final leg of the journey, essentially. And what that peripheral neuron will do is it will ultimately carry the message to a target, which we know already now because we've talked about that: smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, glandular tissue. So it's pretty complex. So the CNS drugs are the important thing about those CNS drugs is they're acting specifically on the brain and or the spinal cord. So when we start to dive into central nervous system pharmacology, we will quickly realize that it's pretty complicated. Central nervous system drugs are really difficult to study, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Probably the most common reason, excuse me, is that there's a huge amount of drugs that fall under this category. So CNS pharmacology is one of the largest and most important divisions of medicine. One of the things that complicates this is that it's also the least understood. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The main reason is just that human brain, I should say, is incredibly complex. And the disorders that affect the central nervous system are equally complex. And the other thing about the brain and the central nervous system, I should say more specifically, is that it's pretty isolated, right, from the rest of the body. It's protected by either the vertebral column when we're talking about the spinal cord, or the cranium, right, the bones of the cranium, and the meninges and all the other stuff that's in there to kind of keep it isolated and protected, the blood-brain barrier, etc. So it's pretty hard to get at. And also because it's really poorly understood, we're not that excited about going in and kind of messing with it, right? We don't have access to the brain like we do other parts of the body. We don't have access to the chemicals in the brain that easily. Right, there aren't that many good testing methodologies that can give us pretty concise information about every single little portion of the brain. And the other thing about the brain, in this context of being incredibly complex, is there's a huge amount of redundancy as well. So it's not like this one part of the brain does this one job and another part of the brain does another job. There's a lot of overlap and overlay. And that makes this also pretty difficult to study. So it's a huge class of drugs. We're not even going to be able to go over all of them. We're just going to pick and choose some of the more important classes of CNS pharmacology and also least understood. So continuing on with this little overview in relationship to neurons and neurotransmission. So we've already talked about neurons. We know that a neuron is the functional cell of the nervous system. So a central nervous system neuron is going to be the functional cell of the actual central nervous system. We've got more than 100 billion neurons working to communicate messages by way of the action potential, right? That's how messages travel on individual neurons, as they travel in the form of an electrical signal, which we call an action potential. In the central nervous system, what we see is the vast majority of neurons are going to communicate with other neurons. So it's a little bit different than in the peripheral nervous system, where we learned about preganglionic and postganglionic neurons communicating with one another, but the message ultimately that was communicated, if you will, via these peripheral nervous neurons had more to do with what was happening at the target. So in the peripheral nervous system, at the targets, we have a neuron communicating with a target or organ or gland, right? Skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, glandular tissue, etc. But in the central nervous system, the communication is really between interconnecting neurons. And these pathways are not particularly linear. They're incredibly complex. They run all over the place, right? From one part of the brain to another part of the brain, from that part of the brain to another part of the brain, right? There's a lot of interconnection. There's all these neural networks, we like to call them, that are incredibly complex. And that complexity, it seems, provides the basis for our higher brain functions. Higher brain functions are like higher level thinking and cognition, learning, memory, all those really complex, emotions, all those really complex kind of behaviors that sort of makes humans stand away from other mammals, other animals. The ability to perform these higher brain functions. So we are going to kind of try to make some sense out of that and then use the drug model to sort of, explain some of these different areas of the brain. All right, so the drugs are going to work just like drugs work almost everywhere, right? So they're going to interface with the receptor, and they're going to act at synapses. And remember, a synapse is just a place where two neurons come together. So when these drugs act at synapses, what that's going to do is it's going to perhaps release a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter, and there's quite a few neurotransmitters in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, we really only had to focus on two. One was acetylcholine and the other one was norepinephrine. Both of those neurotransmitters are players in the central nervous system as well. But there's probably 30 more that we know of that also play a role in CNS transmission. So some of our neurotransmitters are going to be stimulatory, others are going to be inhibitory, right? So that's something new for us to add to our conversation. The drugs can act at synapses by stimulating receptors, and they can stimulate receptors as an agonist. They can also block receptors. The other thing that we haven't talked about, I don't believe yet, is another function of CNS drugs, and this seems to be more of a chronic kind of a situation. So if the drug's been on board for a time, or there is habitual use for quite a long time, what we sometimes will see is the actual number of receptors, or the term often used to describe this is receptor density, changes. And if a drug causes more receptors for that particular chemical neurotransmitter to be produced, we would call that upregulating the receptor density. Another thing that's probably a little bit more common is downregulation of receptor density. And that means that over time, because of the concentration of the drug, as the change in the neurochemistry, especially in cases where you might have synapses flooded with a neurotransmitter at higher, like supraphysiologic doses, much higher concentrations than would naturally be there. What seems to happen over time is the actual number of receptors for that particular neurotransmitter decreases. So you can have a lot of neurotransmitter in the synapse, but if there's not an abundance of receptors, then the effects are going to lessen. And this seems to play a role in in cases where we see the efficacy of a drug decrease over time. Kind of the classic example of this are the antidepressant agents, and we'll talk more about that later on. So this downregulation of the receptor is another issue. When we look at the synapse specifically, so there's just a couple pictures here. So this is normal transmission, right? So this is a synapse. We've got one neuron here, and we've got another neuron here releasing. So this neuron is stimulated, right? An action potential travels down this neuron, which ultimately causes the neurotransmitters to be released into the synapse. The neurotransmitter would bind, in this case, a downstream receptor. And if this neuron is brought to threshold, then we would propagate that impulse, right? So that's neuron to neuron transmission, and that's normal. Like I said, new to our discussion is we have both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, or excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So in this case, we've got another neuron that's stimulating this particular neuron to increase the release of neurotransmitter, which would cause an increase in transmission. So that would be excitatory, enhanced transmission. This is an inhibitory neuron, which would downplay the neurotransmitter release, and it would cause an inhibition of the impulse. So there's all kinds of different options, and it's complicated, right? In lots of synapses, you have excitatory and inhibitory neurons, and whatever sort of is there in the most abundance is going to ultimately win out, whether we see excitation or inhibition of a message. So it's pretty complicated. Another thing that's kind of ups the ante for central nervous system drugs is that the CNS is isolated. And I think I mentioned this previously. We've got something called the blood-brain barrier, which is it's not a completely impenetrable barrier, but it's less permeable than your average membrane, right? And the reason for that is because those cells are packed really tight, right? There's not a lot of space in between the individual cells. And the reason for that is that the CNS is protected, right? This is one of our levels of protection. But when we talk about drugs, in order for us to develop a drug that has an effect on the central nervous system, it's got to be able to access it. So one thing that we know is all our CNS drugs must be fat soluble, incredibly lipid soluble. And the more lipid solubility the drug exhibits, the easier it will be to pass. So things that are lipid soluble are going to pass easily. Things that are very small, you see water, oxygen, and glucose, oxygen being very lipid soluble, water being very small, are able to gain access. So when drugs are in the development process, if it's going to be a central nervous system drug, then of course we've got to be able to get it in there. And so it has to be able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier. All right, so I've sort of alluded to this. I said earlier that we've got lots of neurons, more than 10 billion neurons, and more than 2 neurotransmitters, right? So we've talked previously about norepinephrine and acetylcholine. Those are definitely players. We've got dopamine, another big player. Dopamine ultimately gets converted into norepinephrine. It's kind of an upstream analyte of norepinephrine. Serotonin, or 5-HT, another neurotransmitter found in the central nervous system, although found in a much greater concentration in the peripheral nervous system. Like 80 to 90% of serotonin is actually produced peripherally. It's not specifically a CNS neurotransmitter. GABAs are big inhibitory neurotransmitter. Histamine is another big player in the central nervous system. Glutamate is a most abundant neurotransmitter, and it's excitatory. And some of the opiates, such as the endorphins and the enkephalins, these are all over the place in the central nervous system. We have at least one receptor for each different neurotransmitter, and in many cases there's more than one receptor subtype. Like for dopamine, for example, there's a dopamine 1 and a dopamine 2. For GABA, there's different receptor subtypes. For glutamate, there seems to be different receptor subtypes. So we've got at least one receptor, if not more than one receptor for each different neurotransmitter. So you can see why this is getting so complicated. And the other thing is we don't really know the function of each neurotransmitter at each portion of the brain, right? They act different at different parts of the brain, right? One thing we can figure out is we do have the ability to sort of be able to tell where, if we have an area that has more neurotransmitter concentrated in a certain location. That seems to be something we can figure out, but we don't know exactly the function of each of those neurotransmitters. An example of this is with norepinephrine, which we've already talked about. We know that norepinephrine seems to be, so norepinephrine is going to be present at our adrenergic synapses, which we already know about. And norepinephrine, synapses or adrenergic synapses are super abundant in the hypothalamus, also in the limbic system, which I'm going to talk about more in a little bit. It has a lot to do with our emotions, and the reticular activating system, which has to do with our level of alertness and arousal, if you will. When we think about norepinephrine, it seems to activate parts of the brain to make us heighten our level of alertness, which kind of makes sense, right? This is fight or flight too, right? That's one of the things with fight or flight. We're heightened. Our sensory system and our acuity and our alertness is all heightened. Drugs that modify these adrenergic synapses in the central nervous system are going to be our stimulants. So like caffeine goes on this list. Our amphetamines also are on this list. There's certain antidepressants, specifically the tricyclic antidepressants, which increase the release of norepinephrine or the availability of norepinephrine at the synapse. There's other ones like dopamine. The dopamine synapses are called dopaminergic synapses. Dopamine, we know, is kind of concentrated in a couple areas. It's definitely concentrated in the limbic structures of the cerebral cortex, specifically the basal ganglia and the substantia nigra. We know that dopamine's a very interesting molecule. Dr. Candace Pert, who is a pretty interesting neurologist, she coined dopamine the master molecule of addiction. So in addiction and medicine around addiction, there's always some conversation about dopamine. High levels of dopamine seem to be implicated in some of our neuroaffective disorders, specifically schizophrenia, probably also OCD probably plays a role. With dopamine probably plays a role with that as well. I said earlier that there's two different types of dopamine receptors. The dopamine 1 receptor is stimulatory. Dopamine acts like as a stimulant at that receptor. And at the dopamine 2 receptor, it's inhibitory. Certain drugs like cocaine and amphetamines, their stimulating actions is due to the effect they have at dopamine receptors. There's some debate whether marijuana might also, some of its psychoactive effects may be attributed to dopamine activity. In terms of drug therapy, we're going to talk about dopamine receptors when we talk about psychosis. Our antipsychotic medications will block dopamine receptors. And we're also going to talk about stimulating dopamine receptors when we talk about Parkinson's disease. Let's see here. Here's another little chart for you to look at if you want to, looking at some of our primary CNS neurotransmitters. I just talked about norepinephrine, which is down here. It's distributed all over the place in the central nervous system. We've already talked about it in the autonomic nervous system as well. We were just talking about dopamine. Here it is. We are familiar with acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to be a player at our cholinergic synapses. We've talked about them peripherally. but in the brain, acetylcholine is almost always stimulatory as well. There seem to be a lot of cholinergic synapses in the motor cortex as well as the basal ganglia, but they're not very common. But those particular types of synapses aren't very common in other areas of the brain. Acetylcholine or cholinergic synapses are going to be important to our discussions around Parkinson's disease as well as Alzheimer's disease. What else do we have on here? Let's talk a little bit about these guys, the endorphins and the enkephalins. So these guys, the endorphins and the enkephalins, these are small peptides that are secreted usually by neurons in the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the limbic system, and the spinal cord. The important thing about these particular chemicals is the receptor for these molecules is the opioid receptor. And the opioid receptor clinically is involved in pain transmission. Sometimes endorphins and enkephalins are referred to as our natural opioids. They're produced endogenously by our body, and they have effects similar to morphine and other opioid drugs, but again, we're not producing them in super physiologic doses, so it's not going to be quite as pronounced. When we talk about, we'll talk a little bit about opioids in our conversation around pain. And so opioids like morphine, for example, and codeine, those drugs, heroin is another one, but that's not a clinical drug, of course. Those drugs produce their effect by binding opioid receptors. So we'll talk a little more about that in our live lecture more than anything. Let's skip down here to GABA for a minute. Gamma aminobutyric acid. It's of the neurotransmitters that are most abundant in the central nervous system. GABA is one, and glutamate is the main one. GABA is the second most common, and glutamate is the most common. GABA, however, is a inhibitory neurotransmitter. So what that means is it is going to decrease synaptic transmission. GABA is found throughout the brain, but it's found in a large amount in the basal ganglia and the hypothalamus. There's more than one GABA receptor subtype. Where we're going to focus our attention on GABA receptors is when we talk about our depressants, specifically the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines. They're going to act by stimulating that receptor, the GABA receptor, and they are going to decrease neuronal transmission. They're inhibitory. So where we use those are most commonly are anxiety disorders for the benzodiazepines, seizure disorders for both the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines. Things like insomnia. In some cases, the benzodiazepines are used quite a bit for insomnia. So there's these drugs, the benzodiazepines there's a huge number of them, and they're used with quite a large amount of frequency. And then finally, the glutamate just below right here. Glutamate is our most abundant neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It's distributed all over the place. It's always excitatory in nature. There's more than one glutamate receptor subtype. One that's been particularly studied is the NMDA or N-methyl D-aspartate receptor, and that one seems to play a pretty important role in memory and in learning. Excuse me. There's some other things that also bind to that NMDA receptor other than glutamate. One thing is zinc, magnesium, the amino acid glycine, and a drug called phenylcyclidine, which is a hallucinogen, also binds to the NMDA receptor. So this is excitatory. So this is going to be stimulatory to the central nervous system. So these would be our central nervous system stimulants, for example, would hit these guys. I was going to say something else about those. Oh, another thing about glutamate is when you have high levels of glutamate, it can actually cause death to neurons. And that might be what the mechanism that's responsible for certain types of neurotoxicity in relationship to CNS drugs. I think I did not talk yet about serotonin at any detail. So serotonin, like I said, serotonin, synapses are going to utilize the neurotransmitter serotonin, also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine or 5-HT. Their serotonin synapses are located in the central nervous system, but like I said, way more serotonin receptors are found other places. 98% of serotonin receptors are found outside of the central nervous system. They're found in platelets, they're found in mast cells. There's a huge amount of serotonin that's produced by the gastrointestinal system. So it's a big player, not just in the brain. In the brain, however, serotonin receptors are found in close association, with adrenergic synapses as well. One other thing about serotonin that you might not know is serotonin is actually used by the body to synthesize the hormone melatonin in the pineal gland. So melatonin we know is one of the hormones that help to kind of set our sleep-wake cycles, our circadian rhythm. And so serotonin is converted into melatonin. So that's one thing to think about. Low levels of serotonin in the central nervous system have been associated weakly, I will say, I'll throw that in my own opinion, with anxiety and impulsive behavior, including suicidal ideation. But it seems also that high levels of serotonin kind of do the same thing. So serotonin, for a while we thought, oh, this is the panacea. We figured out a lot of our affective disorders and kind of hung it on serotonin, but it seems to be quite a bit more complicated than that. However, serotonin receptors do play a very important role in the mechanism of action of our most commonly used antidepressants. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so you can kind of see why this is complicated, right? Because we have all of these neurotransmitters, they're all over the place, and some drugs are going to be completely stimulatory, some are going to be completely inhibitory, some are going to selectively stimulate or inhibit different parts of the brain. So that's kind of how we're going to break it down to talk about it in our coming videos. I want to talk just a tiny bit about the brain itself, just more for review and how it pertains specifically to the pharmacology of the central nervous system. So the bulk of the brain, all this stuff, the bulk of the brain is the cerebrum, as you know. The cerebrum is the thinking part of the brain, and it's responsible for all of our higher level functions, including perception, speech, conscious movement, the controlling of skeletal muscles, all kinds of stuff. It's the largest part by weight, and the most advanced portion of the brain. Disorders of the cerebrum can be pinpoint, or they can be generalized. Oftentimes sort of focal abnormalities, so like a more damage to a specific region of the cerebrum would be the result of a stroke. And in the more specific the damage to a specific region, the more understandable the symptoms. For example, like if you had a stroke in the back of the brain where the occipital cortex was located, you would expect to see vision abnormality. If you had a stroke in the temporal lobe, you would expect to see issues with hearing and those kinds of. But it's not always that simple, right? Because generalized disorders that kind of affect the cerebrum in a sort of more of a wide range, they're going to produce all kinds of symptoms, from drowsiness all the way to anxiety, depression, hallucinations, etc. All right, let's switch here for a minute. Okay, so as we know, the cerebrum is divided into lobes, and each of those lobes kind of has a specific function. We're not going to talk too much about that for our class currently. I do want to talk a little bit about the thalamus. Here we have the thalamus right in this region. The thalamus is really important because it's a relay center. So basically what the thalamus does is it routes ascending information that comes up the spinal cord through the brainstem to the thalamus, and then it gets routed to, sensory information goes to the sensory cortex, carrying information about sound, sights, pressure, pain, etc., temperature. And then once it gets routed, it gets analyzed, interpreted, and then the appropriate response will be developed ideally. So basically, any information that's going to the cerebrum has to get routed through the thalamus. So the thalamus is really important. Portions of the thalamus make up the limbic system, which is an area of the brain I'm going to show you in a minute that controls mood and motivation. Abnormalities of the thalamus have been associated with all kinds of mood disorders, specifically OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress, potentially, anxiety disorders, etc. Which we don't have on this picture is the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus is below the thalamus, right? You see, here's the pituitary gland hanging down. So the hypothalamus is controls all of our major viscera. So it controls the visceral body, if you will, your major organs. Regulates your hunger, thirst, water balance. All those very important vital organ centers are located in the hypothalamus. Body temperature is controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also part of the limbic system, which is associated again with emotions and memory. Some neurons in the hypothalamus actually do connect to the brainstem to affect the vital centers such as the respiratory rate, blood pressure, heart rate, etc., pupil size, those kinds of things. All right, so that's the hypothalamus. I want to point out the cerebellum back here. The cerebellum controls muscle movement, balance, posture, and muscle tone. So it's involved in learning fine motor skills, and it keeps your muscular motion smooth and continuous. So it gives this like smoothness to movement. So cerebellar disorders cause the movement to kind of be ratcheting rather than smooth. So what else do we need to think about here? Jerky movements is what I'm trying to say. Let's flip here and look at the brainstem. So this is a kind of a nice view of the thalamus up here. So these are going to be tracks that are going to ascend. So it's cut, but they're going to ascend to the cerebrum. So here we've got the brainstem. You've got the pons, I should start with the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. That's the brainstem. So the brainstem connects the spinal cord to the brain, as you know, I'm sure. Because of its really important location, connecting the spinal cord to the brain, it's going to be a big relay center as well, basically relaying all the messages traveling to and from the brain have to go through the brainstem. It's got some of our major reflex and control centers that involving breathing, heart rate, vision, swallowing, coughing, and vomiting. All those very important control centers are located in the brainstem. Injuries to the brainstem can be fatal because they can disrupt those vital functions. Excuse me. In the brainstem, we have clusters of scattered neurons, which are known as the reticular activating system. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, a little bit more when I start to talk about the functional systems of the nervous system. Okay, I already talked about this blood-brain barrier. The thing about the blood-brain barrier, again, is it provides this, provides a barrier, right? Because those cells are super, super tightly packed. In most regions, capillaries are more porous, but not so much in the brain. In the brain, those endothelial cells form very tight junctions that create a seal or a barrier to many substances. Again, the only things that are going to get in with relative ease are things that are highly lipid soluble. I mean, this is all about protection, right? We need to protect the brain from pathogens or toxins that are water soluble. Lipid soluble toxins are going to be able to get in there. Okay, unfortunately. All right, let's see here. So I just want to finish this up with a little conversation about the functional brainstem. So functional systems of the brain are basically clusters of neurons that work together to form a common function. They don't have to be all at the same location. In most cases, they're kind of spread out from through different structures or different actual brain locations. The clusters of neurons that I want to focus on are going to be the limbic system, the reticular activating system, the basal ganglia, and the extrapyramidal system. So again, these clusters of neurons working together functionally to perform a job. They don't have to be next to one another. In many cases, they're located fairly far apart from one another, but they form a network that acts as a coordinated unit. And this is where it starts to get really complicated, because it's sort of like a very diffuse web that spreads throughout this highly complicated organ. All right, so just really quickly, the limbic system. So this is a group of deep brain structures that are responsible for emotional expression, learning, and memory. So the limbic system, again, it's groups of neurons that are spread out, right? So you can kind of see a picture. I'm going to toggle, show you an actual picture of a brain, right, with the limbic system kind of there. So let's go back here for a minute. So there's a couple players here. The cingulate gyrus plays a role in emotion, the thalamus relaying information, essentially. The hippocampus is involved in learning and memory, and the amygdala is involved in emotion and memory. So basically emotional states, that's kind of what the limbic system gets credit for, kind of being in charge of our emotions, which is not the only thing, but it's definitely a player. Signals are routed through the limbic system, connecting with the hypothalamus and affecting autonomic actions. Like, for example, like emotions can make your heart race, your pupils change, those kinds of things, your breathing rate change. There's also connections with the cerebrum that potentially allow us to use logic to override emotional reactions. And I'm using that word potentially because some of us are better at that than others. So the limbic system is really important and complicated, I guess we should say. All right, let's see what else. Here's our picture. Okay, the reticular activating system. So this, again, another network of neurons that are found along the entire brain, the length of the brain stem. Stimulation of the reticular activating system causes heightened alertness and arousal of the entire brain. So what the reticular activating system, well, let me continue. So inhibition of the reticular activating system seems to cause kind of a sedation, drowsiness, and can cause people to go to sleep, in sleep induction. I think what is important clinically in terms of drugs, because we're going to talk about central nervous system stimulants in our first video on the drugs, and central nervous system stimulate the entire brain, and when they do so, they also they stimulate the reticular activating system, and they're used for most commonly for one particular condition, which is called attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder. So what the reticular activating system seems to do is it seems to act as a filter that basically allows us to ignore signals that are not immediately important. So either they're weak, they're repetitive, or they're unimportant unimportant stimuli. So essentially, we are being bombarded by information all of the time. And if our reticular activating system is doing its job, it acts as a filter to allow us to kind of filter out the stuff that's not important, and instead allows us to focus our attention on individual tasks by transmitting the important information to the brain's higher brain centers. So it's sort of like, downplays all of the other stuff, all the sounds, all the lights, all the stuff that's not necessary for that moment. And instead, it allows us to kind of focus the important information to where it needs to go in the cerebral cortex. So the idea is if somebody's reticular activating system is under functioning, they're not able to filter out all that information. And so that's one of the arguments for giving a drug that actually stimulates the reticular activating system, because it would allow for that filtering capacity to kind of come to the forefront. It's pretty interesting. All right, the basal ganglia, the basal nuclei, is another cluster of neurons that help regulate the initiation and termination of skeletal muscle movement. It also seems to help initiate and terminate certain cognitive function like memory, learning, planning, and attention. There's connections between the basal ganglia and the limbic system that are associated with different pathologies, or specifically psychosis. Attention deficit disorder also plays a role with basal ganglia and the limbic system, as well as the reticular activating system. Obsessive compulsive disorder. One thing we definitely know is that one of the neurotransmitters that's found in high abundance in the basal ganglia, if you remember from earlier, is dopamine. And when somebody has Parkinson's disease, dopamine transmission is reduced throughout the entire basal ganglia. So one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about the basal ganglia is talking about drugs that affect the basal ganglia, or drugs for Parkinson's disease. Okay, so the thing I didn't put another slide, and I wanted to put another slide, I'll put it up and start the next video with it, is the extrapyramidal and the pyramidal systems of the brain. So the extrapyramidal system basically is going to control the voluntary movement of skeletal muscles that the messages originate in the cerebrum, and they travel down basically through the central nervous system in tracks or pathways. So basically there's two main pathways. One is the pyramidal pathway, which is a direct shot, and the other is an extrapyramidal pathway. So the pyramidal pathways are pretty easy, and they're basically responsible for carrying voluntary information from the cerebrum straight down through the motor cortex, and ultimately concluding with the movement of skeletal muscles. The extrapyramidal pathway is a lot less linear, a lot less direct. The extrapyramidal system controls movement, complex muscular movements specifically, and posture. And it also is going to be important because certain drugs, especially the antipsychotic agents, affect the extrapyramidal systems. So the Parkinson's disease, the site of the initiation of the extrapyramidal pathways are oftentimes the basal ganglia. So people with Parkinson's disease, a lot of their symptoms are extrapyramidal in nature. Their movement disorders, their tremors, the jerking, the spasms, the drooling, all of that has to do with extrapyramidal pathway. And so when somebody's taking a drug that also basically decreases dopamine at the basal ganglia, sometimes the drugs will induce a Parkinsonian-like syndrome. And that would be because they're affecting the extrapyramidal pathway. So that is it for our little review of the central nervous system. So we're going to pick it up with diving into some of our drugs. We're going to start with the central nervous system stimulants in the next video.